it's pretty much been on the tongues of every Barbadian across Barbados and across the diaspora. Believe me, the eyes of the Caribbean have been on Barbados for the last few weeks, and with good reason. Top of mind for everybody, the state of the Barbados economy. That's what we continue to look at this evening on The People's Business. Thank you so much for joining us. Also here, rounding out this evening's panel, we have with us Mr. Patrick Hoyos. He is a journalist with the Broad Street Journal. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
And back with us this evening, he only arrived back in the island yesterday. We have Dr. Ronnie Yearwood, who is a lecturer and corporate finance lawyer. Welcome, Ronnie.
Thank you very much for having me.
We go way back to early days.
Indeed.
And we also have Krystle Howell, who's secretary of the board of the Institute of Internal Auditors, Barbados chapter. Good to have you with us again, Krystle.
Thanks, Tisha.
And thanks for making time out of your busy schedule. President of the Barbados Economic Society, Mr. Shane Lowe. Good to finally meet you, even though I feel like I know you already, because your name is one of those names that's been, you know, out there for the last few weeks. Good to have you with us.
Happy to meet you, Tisha, and happy to be here.
All right, so we also want you to be a part of this discussion. You can get in about the second or third segment. We're going to give you a chance to come in with your questions and comments as well. I know that you will want to pose your questions to this evening's panel, and we want you to be able to get in. So 228-5562 or 228-5563. You can call us, or you can send your emails to talk@cbc.bb. So up for discussion this evening, the state of the Barbados economy, that and so much more when we come back.
There has been a level of creativity in spreading the burden in the way in which we've spread it. And as I said, in these matters I prefer time to be my ally rather than self-praise. So let time be our ally. What matters at the end of the day is how Barbadians can get through this process. There will be dislocation. We're dieting. I dieting now. I wish I wasn't, because I know what I would eat today. But the bottom line is that we do things to get to a certain destination, to get better, and then once we get there, we can take control of our lives.
All right, that was the Honourable Mia Motley speaking at a press conference yesterday after her return following a meeting with the International Monetary Fund. Welcome back to The People's Business. So without further ado, let's really get to it. I'd like to hear your responses on your thoughts generally on the measures that have been instituted and your thoughts on them, starting with you, Pat.
Thanks a lot. As Ms. Motley said, she has tried to rebalance the burden, and I think that eased a lot of what may have been pain if you had just had more taxation. She also removed the hated NSRL tax and the UWI fees, and she replaced road tax with a day-to-day tax on gasoline. There are many others. There's too much to get into right now, but I wanted to say at the outset that what you saw there is part of the reason that she is able to do this, administer what is going to be bitter medicine, especially in September, with the second part of the budget. Because to put a tag on her, you could say she's our first social media prime minister, and that has, you see how how Ms. Motley put in the little thing about diet. Very few prime ministers in the past, at least in Barbados, would have been have this mix of seriousness and informality, unless they were cracking some big joke in their discourse, and I think that tone is what has really given her a lot more credibility with the country.
All right, we're going to get back to you on that. Ronnie, your thoughts?
I think the budget tried to do three things in my mind. One was to get state-owned enterprises off the books. The second was to create more efficient points for tax collection. And the third was to spread the tax base. Now, I've got certain concerns about each of those things and the effectiveness of the measures, but I can understand why they had to be done, and I can see the direction that the Prime Minister is trying to take the country in through these particular measures. But those are just my initial thoughts, and I can get back into them later. As I said, there were three big things that stood out for me in the budget. One, to move certain state-owned corporations off the government books. Two, to make tax collection more efficient. And three, to spread the tax burden.
Krystle, your thoughts?
I think it was a give and take of what the IMF would require. Going through the IMF report, there are certain requirements with regards to taxation, the removal of subsidies for state-owned entities, greater efficiencies within the collection of revenue systems, and there are a whole host of areas that usually have not been taken as seriously as the taxation bit in the past. So I see some give and take because there are some areas in the budget that would not have been in alignment with what the IMF would expect. For instance, the 5% increase to public servants and the increase in the non-contributory pension. These are things that would not have been under advisement, but there was a host of things that are in alignment with what would be expected. So I'm assuming that the give and take would come up in the negotiations to show that they're trying to take the budget seriously and take into consideration the needs of the country.
Shane.
So I thought that the budget was it attempted to close the government's financing gap, and that was particularly important for a number of reasons. Number one, the decision to announce suspension of external payments to external creditors, as well as to announce the intention to restructure domestic debt. And of course, the lack of preference, if you want to put it that way, to actually use the central bank and the NES for future financing meant that until an IMF program is put in place, the government really has very few financing options. So it was very necessary to try to reduce the level of the fiscal deficit or actually eliminate it altogether. Now that is going to be very important, but that hinges on the timing of the negotiations or completion of negotiations with the creditors in the debt restructuring, which is in an attempt to reduce the interest costs the government has to pay every year. The second component, I think, that was particularly interesting was the shift in the burden from the lower income segments of society to the middle and upper income segments, and also the shift in income from domestic players to non-residents, namely tourists. If you think about our international business sector, it used to generate substantially more revenue than it does now, and that allowed us to have the social services that we had in the past. And now that that revenue has somewhat fallen off, I see the taxes on the tourism sector as an attempt to replace that that lost foreign source income. And the final thing is the infrastructure spending, which was necessary. And I think the big question was, well, how is this going to be financed? And I suppose a number of the taxes that were put in place were there or supposed to finance quite necessary infrastructure spending.
All right, so now that we've all summarized, let's take a look at what you believe to be the high points of the Prime Minister's presentation of this mini budget that was anything but mini, in my opinion. It certainly was a meal-sized budget. It wasn't a snack of any sort. So what were the high points? Let's start with you, Shane. What do you think are the high points? Because we're looking at things that we believe will be able to get us to a sustainable place of sustainability when we talk about our economic affairs. So what were the high points for you?
I think the initial moves to move some of the state-owned entities from relying on central government for transfers and subsidies. The BTMI, the QEH, and the Sanitation Services Authority were three that were identified as being particularly dependent on the government to have annual funding. And I think the IMF in their Article 4 report continues to mention the fact that these entities need to be reformed in some way so as to reduce the expenditure burden on the government and to reduce its fiscal deficit. So while there is likely to be more comprehensive restructuring of these entities and other entities in phases 2 and 3, I think the fact that the Prime Minister started to address these issues and to find financing mechanisms for them was particularly heartening to see.
Krystle.
The thing I love most about the budget was the push for renewable energy, especially with relation to the transport board and having that move away from a dependency on oil, which does take up a significant portion of our foreign reserves. So seeing that push from not only moving away from things that drain the foreign reserves, but also to look at a greener economy, that was the most exciting to me because it shows an embracing of something that the rest of the world has already taken on. And I look forward to seeing more things like that coming into the budget that show that there's a long-term strategy in addition to the plugging of the holes in the short run.
Pat.
Well, I think that, as I mentioned before in a column that I wrote this week, we are a bit hamstrung in trying to analyze the budget because, as Shane mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of numbers as to what's paying for what and exactly how much is going to be raised, because perhaps the government doesn't even really know the final numbers themselves. And I think that the euphoria, the hallelujah moment, the jubilance of getting rid of what had become, according to election results, a hated regime administration, sort of overrode or has overridden the finer analysis that would eventually have to be applied. It may not be a bad thing because, yes, the very dramatic removal of 2 and maybe a half or a third of SOE, state-owned enterprise, from government coffers, hopefully, through direct taxation on certain groups, is very dramatic. And the election promises that were kept, such as removing NSRL and free UE tuition, etc. But there remain a whole lot of other things to fall into place. And I think that September, when the second budget comes, is going to be hand in hand with this one. You'll be able to take a better look at where the government has to go, and it's not going to be pretty.
Before we move on to Ronnie, though, to continue on with what you said about not necessarily having figures to go on, how accurate are the figures usually? Because we've seen over the years where governments or successive finance ministers have come and said, this tax is going to raise X amount of money, and it really never pans out,
Never
if we're
does.
honest.
Yeah.
So, you know, how important really is it? I mean, projections are important, but when you look at it,
Especially after doing
really
it
been
sort of
strange.
midstream with an estimates approved way back in February, not even March, and without any discussion because Parliament died in the month that you would normally have discussed the estimates. And so there was no real nailing down of what didn't happen as of the budget last May, except the estimates that have come from the central bank. So I just say we are in a bit of a fairyland at the moment because you just don't know. And so I think the government touched pointers to show the IMF they had to do certain things, to show that, you know, if the car breaks down in the middle of the road, we're not going to make any money now because we're not going to get anywhere. So you had to fix certain things, and to also pay off some political promises. And I think the next budget is going to be the next part of the budget is going to be a real one.
all right, when we come back, we'll hear from Dr. Ronnie Yearwood on what he thought were the high points, if any, of this mini budget. Stay with us. Welcome back to those of you watching us online. You can get your questions in as well by sending us an email to talk@cbc.bb. Before we went to break, it was time for us to head over to Dr. Ronnie Yearwood to give us an idea of what he thought were some of the high points, if any, of this past week's budget presentation.
I think Pat touched on a very important point in terms of the euphoria and in terms of some of the analysis coming through the budget. And it's important that we do shows like this. And you know, I think this is real credit to all of us here in what we're trying to do with the budget. We're trying to cut through some of that to really look at the budget and what was done and how that prepares us for phase 2 and phase 3. And I take a certain position with persons who said, you know, there can be no critique of the budget because this is phase 1, it's early government. I don't think that's right. And as a policy analyst and someone who does this sort of thing, we have to be able to break through that, and we have to be able to present credible, balanced, objective views. I think For me, as I said, the budget had three main things it tried to do in terms of taxation spreading, in terms of moving certain state-owned enterprises off the books. And as Krystle said also, those are points trying to match what was in the IMF report. And if you do literally put the budget on one side and the IMF report on the other side, you could almost do a tick-box analysis to see, that's IMF point one said, reform state-owned enterprises, let's show them we're serious. Tick two, IMF says you have to balance the budget, fiscal budget immediately. Let's do it in a year. Tick. IMF says, reform pensions. We'll put that phase 2, phase 3. IMF says reform wage bill. Let's push that to phase 2 or phase 3. IMF said broaden tax burden base. Let's do that. Tick. So for me, I think the budget does meet those objectives. Where I have particular concerns for certain things is, for example, the tax collection. It's more efficient in terms of what the budget did. However, and this is where Shane and Patrick raised this point about details, and not only details about the numbers, but details about the processes. And I'm not sure we've realized, for example, the Barbados Water Authority and the National Insurance Scheme has been effectively turned into tax collectors. Now, that is not their remit. The Barbados Water Authority and the National Insurance Scheme are not tax collection agencies. Do they have resources? However, that is what they've been turned into. But additionally saying, now you pay an additional $150, or you pay 1% for your NIS, employers pay 1%, employee pays 1%. That money is meant to be passed directly to the QAH in terms of that, or for the water bill, that money will pass directly to the sanitation service. All sounds good on paper. However, how does that work in practice when these agencies sometimes themselves struggle to allocate their own internal budgets and to deal with their own internal finances? Where's the audit trail? Where's the accountability? Have new checks and balances being put in place to ensure that if they collect the money actually goes directly to the agency? How do you requisition? So if there's a shortfall at the QH, who does the QH blame? Does it say, NIS, you've not collected our money properly, or does it go to central government to blame central government? Now, and these things are particular concerns for me as someone who's interested in governance. So I'm not saying the increased efficiency is incorrect or it's wrong. However, the process needs to be clearly thought out.
What you're saying is processes need to be in place to ensure that it happens.
Add to that the Grant Yellams with the National Airport, because they're collecting the tax that's going to fund the BTMI.
Yeah. So and then on the BTMI point, great that they've come off the government books, but my additional concern, now you've got the BTMI and you've got the BTI off of the government books. However, they perform very important functions for a very principal revenue earner of our tourism for the economy. So technically, you've almost created another quasi-layer of government agency, but not government agency, with no direct authority. Who audits them? The Auditor General process is being removed. Is there a special audit process for them? And on top of that, now, if, for example, they run out of money per se, do they have revenue raising potential to borrow loans? And who will guarantee that?
Ronnie and his finance head is getting in terms of where we're going with this. And I can understand that, because that's very important. The process by which things are done, that's important too. But I think it's equally important for us to first analyze what is put on the table before we really delve into actually how things will unfold.
Well, I think
especially for the average person, because I seem to remember for Barbadians, for the average person, hearing the letters IMF, it was an automatic, this government or these politicians are crazy, they will fail. Did you say IMF? Barbadians will never vote you in. And I am certain that is not only in my neck of the woods. So what has changed? What's the difference? Why are Barbadians now so open to hearing about going to the IMF? What has been the big difference that has made a change in Barbadian shape?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there's been more discussion about the IMF and what the IMF does do, what it does not do. How it has changed its posture relative to small economies like ours over the last, I'd say, couple decades. And I think there's a recognition that the policies that were administered over the last 10 years post-recession, while they did seek to raise revenue, they did not close the fiscal gap enough. And the position that the credit rating was in put us in a position where the reserves every year were falling for the last 5 years. And I think people start to think that while usually when you hear IMF, you think devaluation, the fact that the reserves were falling of themselves, that was increasing the probability of a devaluation. So it's kind of like, well, you can't do much worse than to go to the IMF. But I think the level of discussion and public education has certainly increased over the last year or two.
Well, Pat, I don't mean to out your story from tomorrow, but the business authority is already on shelves around Barbados. Do you think that the euphoria that you speak of in your article of tomorrow's business authority, of people kind of being really excited, is eclipsing, the thought processes? Do you think that is what is tied into people being more open to an IMF?
Yes,
system?
because don't forget that at least half, maybe more, of the whole experience of the last couple of weeks has been a government actually doing something, making fixing. They have so many things to fix, and the ministers are out there visiting all kinds of, dug up pipes in the middle of streets and non-functioning sewage and accident emergency wards and so on. It's a moment of tremendous get back to the job type of activity, and people needed to see that. That's what it's not. It's like, thank God somebody's actually trying to deal with these problems, and talking about buses and sewage. If you have to catch your bus, you realize that the bus system really is terrible. So these are things that, as IMF is down in the XYZ part of that alphabet. Oh, IMF, okay, well, if we have no reserves, I guess we'll go, but are we getting buses? Are we getting sewage fixed? Are we getting the hospital fixed? Are we getting a little more money to spend for pensioners? Those things are so crying out that the government has received A triple pluses for actually hitting on them right away.
All right, so these things have certainly added to people's euphoria, as you put it in your article, but let's look at the things that are proposed in the budget. For example, we talked about the removal of the National Social Responsibility Levy. We are all of a certain age, so social media has become a big part of who we are and what we do. Pat, you actually referred to the PM as a social media PM. But online, a lot of people have been saying a lot of these taxes or they're kind of repurposed. What are your thoughts on that, Krystle?
That has happened, and with the widening of the tax base, some persons probably felt as though they should have, as an individual, experienced a lower tax because it's supposed to be spread amongst more people. But you would have removed the NSRL, you would have included the 1% on the employee and 1.5% on the employer. You would have increased the tax bands, so persons who make over $6,250 a month would experience a new level of taxation, and it goes up. You will have the gas tax, the fuel tax, which would impact some persons. They calculated already. I have a lot of persons who say they're actually paying more than the road tax that they would have been paying before. So when persons sit down and calculate, I know many individuals who actually are paying more under the current budget than they would have been before. So there is some disappointment where that is concerned, that it is felt that the tax base was not broadened enough. And then the water, having that as a flat tax after you make the statement that the road tax being a flat tax was unfair, but then you put a flat tax on water.
All right, so when we come back, how could they have broadened the base even more in terms of making more Barbadians pay their fair share, especially since one of the punchlines or one of the most repeated statements for the campaign was, many hands make light work. We're going to take a break here and come back on The People's Business. We're discussing the state of affairs in our economy. We're going to take your calls as well. So line up 228-5562 or 228-5563. Send your emails to talk@cbc.bb. Stay there. Welcome back to the People's Business. This evening we're discussing the state of the Barbados economy with Pat Hoyos, Dr. Ronnie Yearwood, Krystle Howell, and Shane Lowe. Welcome back to you. Okay, now we've talked a lot about repurposed taxes. There's still a lot going on in terms of Barbadians having to pay. The base has in fact been broadened based on some of your responses. You don't believe it's been broadened enough. So what could the current administration have done differently, considering where they said the state of the economy was when they came into power? What could they have done differently in the budget, to your mind, Shane, to ease more of a burden from Barbadians' pockets?
I think one of the things they could have done, and I suspect a similar measure maybe come in the later phases, was to reform the value-added tax. So the value-added tax is currently at 17.5%, but there are quite a few exemptions, some of which were taken away in a previous budget, but there's still quite a few there. And it means that certain goods and services, whether you are poor or rich, you don't have to pay VAT on these items. Now, when the Bahamas introduced the VAT in, I think it was 2015, they introduced it at a very low rate, about 7.5%, but with virtually no exemptions. And what they did is that they took the additional revenue from not having the exemptions, and they said they could target specifically those people who needed the relief. So I think one of the things that could have been done, and maybe done in a previous phase, is to widen or remove those exemptions, so more people are paying VAT on those items. But then those people who really need that assistance, who are the most vulnerable in society, you target them specifically, whether it be with the reverse tax credit or through the welfare department, so that not everyone, whether you earn $2,000 a month, $1,000 a month, or $20,000 a month, not everyone is getting access to these concessions.
I always find it very interesting when we start talking about the basket of goods, especially considering what you see in it, because a lot of the items that people consider to be, I don't know, luxury goods, or they're the items people really should be getting, and a lot of what people should be eating is not in there, which really is adding to our overall debt and the level of non-communicable diseases that we're seeing. So I can see what you're saying in terms of reform in that manner, but it has really to be looked at in a holistic type of way to determine then how you would allocate VAT on certain items and across socioeconomic backgrounds. Ronnie, your thoughts?
Well, I think what was interesting about the budget for me from a tax point of view, because we're discussing taxes, is that the government has been clever in terms of moving a lot of what had become the underground economy in Barbados back into the formal economy. So, for example, take the road tax situation. So many people were avoiding their road tax. We know that. We know people weren't paying the road tax.
You know people?
We know that. I'm not going to call names, but we know that.
You got friends.
But by creating the fuel tax, effectively, all those persons are now moved from that category and they're taxable, and you cannot avoid it. Because either your car will run on the spirit or it has to run on fuel. So it's definitely not running on the Holy Ghost, so you got to go and put some gas in it. So whereas what this government has done is taken a lot of what would have been payable direct taxes, where you had to go into an office and pay up the tax, get a certificate, for example, the solid waste tax. They now moved them to very direct taxable nodes that they know you have to engage in. You have to pay your water bill. You want water. So what they've done is literally moved large chunks of taxation from the underground economy, or people avoiding taxes, to having those taxes. And I think that was a clever move on their part, because the government needs the revenue. It cannot have persons avoiding their taxes. And I agree with you. The tax base has been spread somewhat broader by this. But then I agree with what Shane is saying. Shane made a very important point here, in that perhaps we need to look in terms of means testing more for the services. Instead of having broad universal services, we look at and see what are the poor, or who are the segments of a society that require and utilize the service most, and we target them through resource tax credits or whatever provisions, instead of providing broad universal services, where some people don't access those services because they either have private health insurance or they have private access to different things and they don't need them, but we're still providing them for everybody. And I can understand universal
The
access.
suggestion of means testing has come up on quite a few occasions. I personally can't, think in my brain how it would work, but I'm certain there are people who would understand that. I want to revisit the whole thought of Barbadians playing a role in helping to fund social services. But before we get into that, I'm told we have a caller on the line. Welcome to the program.
Good night.
Welcome. Good evening.
Welcome to the panel. Actually, I'm glad that this discussion is being held on television tonight because it calls for great concern to me. I remember a couple of years ago when we had a recession. The standing government then was being led by Sandyford, and he had said that he would implement a wage freeze for us because we had to bear the brunt of this burden. We had a no confidence vote that was done in Parliament. They lost, re-elect a new government, and they came in and used the same policies. Now we see the results of that. I am saying
I don't believe that's what happened, ma'am.
Most
Hang on.
worst recession that we have just been through, and we were down on the ground for a little while. Now things didn't go on very good because the world, everybody depends on everybody. Money has to flow. Recessions are serious things, and most of the times it leaves somebody leaning, or most nations leaning. You can look at the United States where we see so many people lose their houses and so forth. But what I want to say, is it at this time the right thing for my Prime Minister to be doing at this time, or if it could have been a situation where we could have waited out a little longer? I was listening to the guy there from Ireland, the central bank governor, talking about putting certain things in place in order to see a turnaround. He said he wasn't sure when it would come out, but there would be some kind of restoration somewhere down the road. Somehow I am a little timid about approaching IMF at this time.
All right, thank you. Now, she's mentioned quite a few things. I don't think the no confidence motion against
Didn't fail.
Ursula
It
Sandiford and now,
survived.
Sir Lloyd, it didn't fail. And she talked about him putting in a wage freeze. At that time, it was a cut.
Yeah.
It was a cut on the
8%,
pay.
right?
And then the government after that, which would have been the Owen Arthur administration, they wrote into law.
They
that
reinstated.
reinstated and they wrote into law that you couldn't. So that wasn't completely accurate, but she's raised some very interesting points. And I think that's maybe where people are thinking as well. Why, at this time, why is it right then to go to the IMF now and not to wait and try different policies?
We have no money.
We have,
I
we
think
have
that's
no
so.
money, and if you look at it, Tisha, we have tried the homegrown policies. But there's only, and the Prime Minister's alluded to, well, in fact, more than alluded, there's only so much tax and spend that you can do, because there's only so many people that can bear the taxable burden in the economy. And we've already pretty much tax those people to the fullest degree, and we've already broadened the tax burden to catch those who were trying to avoid the tax net. So in terms of taxing, I could be wrong, but I cannot see much more room to do that. So the IMF is the only option to open up other avenues for international funding.
If the policies, because as I was saying in a break, if we could criticize the policies individually, but as a package, if we had to do it, we would come up with some.
Very similar.
It might not be this one, but it would be this one.
Yep.
And we're basically trying a thing. We're not quite sure. Nobody can say for sure. However, the fundamental point is the local spending is a fundamental part of GDP growth. If you stop people spending, your GDP goes down. Everything in finance, as the economists know, is measured as a percentage of GDP. If you can get your GDP to grow, that's one of the pluses. The second thing is if you reduce your oil bill, because oil prices have gone up, so we spent nearly 150 million or more in buying oil in the last year. If you replace that with strong renewable energy policies for the roofs and other things that we do not have to import as much fossil fuel, that will shave another 100 million in foreign exchange off our bill.
All right, we have a lot of energy in the sky and all around us. So let's see if we'll be able to really capitalize on that. We're saying that with the introduction of some varied ministries as well. So are we on a good path for growth, for sustainability? That and more when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the People's Business. So much to talk about, so little time. I wanted to get to those social services. There's a school of thought that Barbadians have been spoiled for a very long time. And because we haven't been contributing to social services in a direct kind of fashion, of course there are taxes, but not necessarily paying for garbage collection directly, paying for or education from nursery through tertiary and stuff like that directly. What are your thoughts on a phased approach, as could be determined for this one, a phased approach to Barbadians contributing more to the pension, so as another example, this phased approach to Barbadians slowly getting more involved with the delivery of social services?
This goes back to the means testing, and you said that you've never heard of an example of it. Well, let me give you an example of means testing when
I
it
didn't
comes
say
to...
that, Ronnie. I said we've heard about it a lot, but I haven't been given any tangible
Well, that's what I mean.
Well,
that I'm
go
going
right
to give you a
ahead.
tangible way. Now, let's take university education, for example, as an example. Now, I believe in free university education. I've benefited from it, and I think the ladder should always be there for other people to get here. However, if you start to earn a certain level or a certain salary, I then believe that you should be able to make some contribution back into that system more directly. Yes, obviously we're a tax society and you get services, but there's nothing I think that precludes us from saying, okay, you start earning, I don't know, $200,000 a year. Or, I don't know the number. There's no magic number. Say, okay, you've gone to university, now you recontribute some of that money. And that doesn't mean that university education is not free. It just means when we hit a certain level of earning capacity, you add a little back into the system. Now, for persons who never hit that earning capacity, there's no call upon them to pay back a little bit into the system, and that's fine because some jobs are necessary, whether it be primary school teachers, nurses, firefighters, who may never earn $300,000 and $400,000 a year. But you become a big corporate executive and you're earning that. There's nothing that I think that's unfair about a system saying, here, you hit that earning capacity. Can you give a little bit?
Isn't that partially dealt with now the introduction of students having to come and give back?
Yeah.
But I don't think the communities, I think that's one thing, but I don't think that's enough. I think there can be more and there should be more in terms of going back to you said actual direct amount of money, because we have to start finding ways to make things like university education and healthcare sustainable and self-funding. Because again, you don't want to end up 10, 20 years from now us going, again, in the same situation, going like, oh, we don't have any money for health.
But again, in the last administration, 2 budgets ago, I seem to remember the then Minister of Finance pointed directly to certain taxes going to social services, and they didn't meet the targets like we discussed, and so obviously then the social services wouldn't have it. Would have been the QAH to be the beneficiary and the University of the West Indies of certain taxes. So where that doesn't pan out, where really does that leave us? Shane, your thoughts on contributing in this phased approach to social services?
I think you spoke about the pensions, and that is a particularly important one because as Barbados becomes an even older society, then the outlay for pensions will become even greater and greater. And if people aren't contributing to their income when they retire, then that's going to put even more burden on the government. So I think that's a particularly important one. One of the measures or one of the allowances that was taken away some budgets back was the one where you could earn an income tax credit, I believe, for investing in your own pensions. And I thought that that is one that maybe should have been reinstated because you want to encourage people to save for their own retirement. And I believe encouraging people to save for maybe their own education and for healthcare. We have the health levy now, but things like that where you encourage people to not have to depend on the state and to provide their own financing, those are very important things.
All right, let's go back to how we teach our people, because a good place to start, we're talking about financing education, but what about the way we deliver to our children? Are our children taught to think this way, to think in this manner? Are young people taught that they should save toward education, that they should save toward retirement from an early age? Are these systems in place, whether in the public domain or in private institutions, through businesses or in schools? Are we teaching our children, our young people, that they have to get into this frame of mind, especially since, Shane, as you said, we're aging population? What are your thoughts?
I have no idea. I know they have a lot of money in the banking system that the banks would like to lend out. And I think that, yes, I agree you should have more classes on, not business, but how, saving and so forth. But you can't put the burden on the kids right now. The point is for the economy that it has to make more money in foreign exchange and it has to reduce the unemployment rate. We got into this normalization of 10% being okay. It's not okay. This country should be at 7% minimum, something like that, 6, 7, 8. The economists would probably know the better. But that, if more people are working and the money is being generated, a lot of it from overseas, in terms of investment and tourism, then all of our problems will start to soften a little bit. Right now we're dividing up a pie that really doesn't have anything in it.
All right, nothing in the pie from Pat. Okay, let's take another call. Good evening to you. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Pam.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is not fair to the Prime Minister, and the members of Cabinet to say that the taxes have not been spread wide enough. In terms of, especially when we speak about the road tax, when the economist is saying that some people are paying more. Of course, she did say that usage would be important, that if you are using more, you should be paying more, and that it's not fair, like for a normal domestic who may be driving the SUV to work and back home, to be paying $1,800 in road tax, and a heavy-duty vehicle who's working day in, day out is paying $400 or so. So I think the spreading will relate to, for instance, if you look at it, if you go into a store, the same way you're willing to pay extra on a fridge or electrical appliance over a period of time, it's the same thing. If you're going to have a longer opportunity to pay, then it's less burden on you. You have more spending power. So I think that's what's happening with the taxation, and it's being easier on a lot of people. Don't matter those who pay more, they would deserve to pay more this time.
Thank you.
$400 for a subcompact. If you have an SUV, it used to be about $800, $900, and I had to pay $1,600 for a light truck. I don't know if the heavy-duty ones had to pay higher. I never owned one of them. But I mean, that's just a policy decision, good or bad. That's if the Prime Minister said at the end of her press conference before the one yesterday, and I didn't see it in the paper. Somebody asked her, this was at the Hotel Association luncheon, asked her about the tourism amendment, which was an effort to bring hotel investment not up to but closer to the level of the Sandals Sweetheart deal. And Ms. Motley said there are 3 kinds of investment. You have the Sandals deal, you have the other hoteliers who have to go every 2 weeks and with a list and ask for concessions that are supposed to be in the law but have to be signed off,
Who have their
and that's
stuff
going to
held
be
in
got
bond.
right. And then have others that can't even afford to have a bond, so they got
Yeah.
3, and they're going to deal with that. I wish they had been able to deal with that in this mini budget. Hopefully, they'll deal with that in September, because that will unleash spending. And if you get rid of the compliance letters that are necessary, you will unleash a lot of mortgage projects that people cannot get their mortgages
Okay.
because they say they haven't complied and
A
want
lot of
another
these
big
things
bra.
are about controls. So when we come back,
Correct.
we're going to delve in a little bit more. That's Krystle's forte, I believe, and we're going to take your emails as well. Stay with us. Welcome back. In the final moments of the program, Krystle, we can have the most grandiose of plans, and if they aren't properly implemented or controls in place, then there could be mass failure.
Yes. I think overall the budget was the best that you can do given the situation. You weren't handed a thriving economy.
Correct.
You were handed an economy that was on the brink of being bankrupt.
On its knees.
So there's only so much you can do. But my concern is, regardless of the revenue measures that are implemented, how much you try to cut costs. There are so many controls that need to be put in place. And case in point, there was a recent article concerning an accounts clerk at the psychiatric hospital that was able to steal over $1 million. And when you go through just by the article alone, the lack of controls regarding him being able to implement fictitious vendors into the system and being able to collect checks for inventory to that tune that was never received, was the relationship between finance and the inventory manager, that these things were never caught. How are passwords protected, that he was able to use his supervisor's password to be able to input these vendors to begin with. And my concern is, this is not the only case of significant value, but we don't plug these holes to make sure that these things don't happen again. And if you're hearing of these cases, you can only imagine how many more are out there where persons are taking advantage of the system and robbing the government blind, and we're collecting...
Robbing us blind.
Us. It's very true.
It's my money too.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
going to be more of my money in a few weeks.
Exactly,
Yes,
and you
yes.
don't want that. You have this huge effort to collect all of this revenue,
And then no controls.
and it's being lost.
All right, a quick email to the panel. Good evening. Have any real taxes been taken off the backs of Barbadians in the recent budget? We were told that we are the most highly taxed country 2 months ago.
I think you need time. You have to understand the situation that we've gone into. The government has not even been in for a month yet, and we seem to be expecting more of them than we have of any administration in the past. They've given target dates in the manifesto for 6-month and 18-month timelines in which they will be able to achieve certain things, and we need to give them time to get things done. They're communicating extremely well. There isn't anything that you can miss or not be in the know for. They're keeping you in the know of what is going on so that you can see, okay, they've gone this far on this particular promise, and these are the obstacles that they would have hit, these are the setbacks, this is where we're at. So as long as that keeps going and persons keep their manifesto and budget promises at the forefront to make sure that you're still on track, give it time to see if it will work.
To see if it will work. Okay.
Because it's difficult. It's a difficult situation.
Ask the panel, what about the banning of products that we can produce and manufacture up to 75%, the establishment of a hemp industry, school uniforms, workplace uniforms, etc., encourage the opening of indigenous commercial banks owned by Barbadians? These are all measures that can be taken, yet not heard of. And I think that there is indeed an email that has been circulating for Barbadians to get involved. And I think we absolutely should, because
Correct.
we have great ideas. Here's another one. This one is pretty long. I think the Barbadians embrace the IMF this time around because they have now been told the true state of the economy. The economy is very sick. When you're sick, you go to FMH or somewhere else. When the country is very sick and home remedies don't work, you have to go to the IMF. So thank you again. And here's another one. The panel is trying to be fortune tellers. Human behavior is not linear or predictable, and economics is not an exact science. There's only so much that can be collected within a set period. I think that was articulated by the panel as well.
Yeah.
I would like the panel to comment on the actions of the unions in dropping their demands for 20+% increase in wages to 5%, and whether labor is getting the representation it deserves. Is the labor movement being included? Apparently, this has been described as a mini show as well. The last hour has gone so quickly that I feel as though
We'll come back next week to talk about that.
Next week?
All those things.
I'm not sure you're going to make it back next week, Pat. I'm just joking. I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for sharing your questions as well. We're going to try to still share with you throughout the week, and this discussion definitely will continue. Our panel, you've raised some very interesting points, as have our viewers. So again, thank you so much, Pat Hoyos, journalist with the Broad Street Journal. Make sure you read that article in the Business Authority that's out on shelves right now from Pat. Shane Lowe, President of the Barbados Economic Society, Krystle Howell, Secretary of the Board of the Institute of Internal Auditors, Barbados Chapter, and Dr. Ronnie Yearwood, a lecturer and corporate finance lawyer. Thank you all for sharing with us, and thank you for being a part of this evening's presentation. See you next time. Have a great week ahead.